Every so often, I will show up outside my son's door and, like Gandalf in The Hobbit, declare something like this: I'm looking for someone to share an adventure that I'm arranging, and it's very difficult to find anyone. His response is usually like Bilbo's: Good morning! We don't want any adventures here, thank you. Except my son is usually more succinct. Nope, not happening. But every once in a while, I can coax a reluctant acceptance out of him. And that's how one crisp October morning we found ourselves standing on the cobblestones of the riverfront in downtown St. Louis, under the shadow of the Gateway Arch, our city's famous monument. We had gathered there with a group of kids, unique biking and boating adventure. And what we planned to do was to ride 11 miles northward on a trail beside the Mississippi River, then leave our bikes, get into canoes, and paddle back down the river to the Arch grounds downtown. Now, I admit, we rode bikes, not ponies. And we brought balaclavas and not pocket handkerchiefs. And yes, our adventure took place in the heart of the continental United States, not in England, not in the Shire. But still, as we went there and back again, we managed to catch glimpses of Middle-earth right here in the mounds, muddy rivers, and monuments of the Midwest. And I'd like to share those with you today. But first, I need to introduce you to the setting of my story, which is the city of St. Louis, just a few hours away on the other side of Missouri. St. Louis has been known by many nicknames over the years. Here's a few of them. Mound City, because of the presence of many large earthen mounds built by Native Americans hundreds of years before the arrival of Europeans. River City, because French fur traders founded the city near the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. But today, St. Louis is best known as the gateway to the West. Thanks to its position near those two major rivers, St. Louis served as a port and a jumping-off point in the center of the continent for waves of traders, explorers, and settlers who headed west, especially after the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the United States. In 1965, we constructed a stainless steel monument 630 feet tall called the Gateway Arch to commemorate all of this. And in the process, we gained a new nickname, which I will add as in an aside that some scholars say we actually stole from Kansas City. Anyway, mounds, muddy rivers, and a monument. Please keep those in mind now as I come back to the adventure with my son. And we'll start by talking about mounds and moulderings. With its soaring skyscrapers and the glittering Gateway Arch, it's hard not to be awed by the St. Louis riverfront. And as I stood underneath it with my son on that bright, cool October morning, I think I felt much like the hobbit Pippin when he got his first sight of the city of Minas Tirith, riding with Gandalf at the beginning of the Return of the King. Quote, Pippin gazed in growing wonder at the great stone city, vaster and more splendid than anything that he had dreamed of, greater and stronger than Isengard, and far more beautiful. This passage could almost be describing the city of St. Louis with its impressive skyline. But that's not all that Pippin saw. The passage continues, yet it was in truth falling year by year into decay. And already it lacked half the men that could have dwelt at ease there. In every street they passed some great house or court, and yet now they were silent, and no footsteps rang on their wide pavements, nor voice was heard in their halls, nor any face looked out from door or empty window. Unfortunately, this part is also an apt description of St. Louis today. Like many Midwestern cities, St. Louis has declined from its glory days. At the turn of the last century, it was the fourth largest city in the nation and hosted both the World's Fair and the Summer Olympic Games. The population of St. Louis today is just 1/3 what it was at its peak in 1950. My son and I began to see the results of this depopulation and decay not long after we left downtown on our bikes and began riding northward. St. Louis once teemed with immigrants and boomed with industry and manufacturing, but no more. On that day, we rode past brick warehouses, boarded up and abandoned, and concrete structures many stories tall, crumbling and covered in graffiti. We saw scrubby, empty lots with old stone foundations peeking up out of the grass, evidence of homes and buildings that once stood reminders that all these empty neighborhoods were once densely populated decades ago. In the Fellowship of the Ring, Frodo and his friends come across similar ruins after they leave the Shire. These foundations that I saw in North St. Louis were probably much like those at the Barrow Downs, where, quote, stone rings grinned out of the ground like broken teeth in the moonlight. These are the remains of the lost kingdom of Arnor. The hobbits learn the tragic history of the Barrows from Tom Bombadil. Quote, there was victory and defeat, and towers fell, fortresses were burned, and flames went up into the sky. Gold was piled on the biers of dead kings and queens, and mounds covered them, and the stone doors were shut, and the grass grew over all. Tolkien's legendarium is full of burial mounds like these. From the Hill of the Slain, that was raised after the Battle of the Unnumbered Tears in the First Age, to the Barrow Field outside of Edoras in the Third Age. And I will say this morning, Cami Agan and Graham Cheadle had two fantastic talks about mounds and tombs and hallowed ground. So if you didn't see those, make sure you check those out when the videos come out. The landscape of Midwestern America was once dotted with mounds too, which is something that many people don't know. Hundreds of years ago, Native Americans built dozens of mounds on both sides of the Mississippi, from the enormous 10-story tall Monk's Mound in Cahokia, Illinois, to the so-called Big Mound in North St. Louis. Cahokia was a major city. At its peak, around the year 1200, its population may have rivaled Paris or London. By the time Europeans arrived, more than 400 years later, Cahokia had been long abandoned. But the mounds there and across the river in St. Louis remained. After Europeans founded St. Louis, the mounds within the city became a source of pride and mystery. But St. Louisans were ignorant, like Tolkien's Rohirrim, who had, quote, long forgotten the ancient people who had built Harrowdale, even though those people, the Druidane, still lived nearby. Still, while St. Louisans admired the mounds for many years, quote, admiration did not deter development. That's what Patricia Cleary wrote in her book, Mound City. Gradually, the mounds within St. Louis were desecrated and removed, including Big Mound, which is here in this illustration, which had been located at a site near the bike trail where I was riding with my son. Today, only one mound remains within the St. Louis city limits. Orc work, Treebeard might have said. St. Louis's treatment of these mounds is tragic, but there is a glimmer of hope. Earlier this year, the Osage Nation acquired the property of St. Louis's last mound in order to preserve and protect it. So now let's talk about boats. Quite tricky enough. As my son and I kept biking north, the decay gave way to more natural scenes. And eventually we came to a park near the northernmost end of St. Louis City. Here, we traded our bikes for canoes and headed down a hill to the sandy riverside. Going into this canoe trip with my son, I was both excited and a little scared. Sure, I knew how to swim. I'd been on recreational lakes in pontoon boats many times, but I had never ridden in a canoe before, and I certainly had never done any boating on the mighty Mississippi. The Mississippi is no ordinary river. It's the 10th largest in the world by flow, and it truly is dangerous. And I have to admit that, like most of my Midwestern neighbors, I seldom interact with the Mississippi River directly, even though I live just 5 miles away. Sure, I might cross it by bridge or admire it from the shore, but never had my son or I entered its waters like this. It was a daunting prospect. This is something we had in common with Samwise Gamgee and many hobbits at the time of The Lord of the Rings. Like us, the hobbits lived near rivers, and yet, as Tolkien explains in the prologue of The Lord of the Rings, quote, most hobbits regarded even rivers and small boats with deep misgivings, and not many of them could swim. Tolkien establishes a good reason for this fear early in the story, when Gaffer Gamgee recounts how Frodo's father and mother had drowned after they went boating on the Brandywine River. When some of the Gaffer's listeners begin to embellish the tale, he shuts them down, saying, boats are quite tricky enough for those that sit still, without looking further for the cause of trouble. And I'm sure that many Midwestern, city-dwelling Midwesterners might agree, boats on big rivers are bound to be tricky. Because we're so disconnected from river life, we haven't learned any better. Later in the story, the Fellowship plans to journey down the Great River from Lothlorien using light boats given to them by the elves. When they take the boats for a trial run on the Silverlode, Sam is understandably uneasy. Quote, Sam sat in the bows, clutching the sides and looking back wistfully to the shore. The sunlight glittering on the water dazzled his eyes. But before the Fellowship get too far, they're intercepted by Celeborn and Galadriel riding in a swan ship. They invite the Fellowship to a farewell feast in a field at the confluence of the Silverlode and the Anduin rivers. There they rest and receive blessings and gifts before continuing on their journey. Back in the primary world, the organizers of our canoe trip did something similar. We began by paddling out to a large sandy island in the middle of the Mississippi, where we ate lunch and swapped stories. One of our guides told us an interesting tale. During the coronavirus pandemic, he quarantined not by staying at home, but by paddling out to this same island with his dog and living in isolation there for a month. I imagined him during that time as, quote, his own master, a Midwestern version of Tom Bombadil, quote, withdrawn into a little land within bounds that he has set, though none can see them, waiting perhaps for a change of days. When we finally got underway, the guides put us at ease. My son and I didn't know what we were doing, but they did, and I think the same was true for the Fellowship. They, Legolas, Boromir, and Aragorn all had experience handling boats. And surprisingly, so did one of the four hobbits, Merry Brandybuck. Quote, not all of us look on boats as wild horses, he had told Celeborn earlier. With experts at the paddle, Sam slowly loses his fear over several days journeying down the river, deciding that, quote, boats were maybe not as dangerous as he had been brought up to believe. Still, unlike me and my son, Sam never enjoys the ride. The boat is uncomfortable and cramped. Okay, next let's talk about rivers, the veins of the world. The sea is a powerful image in Tolkien's work, as is the idea of sea longing. But it's something many Midwesterners have never experienced. Here in the middle of a vast continent, most of us are like the hobbits, few of whom, quote, had ever seen or sailed upon the sea, and fewer still had ever returned to report it. But whether the hobbits realized it or not, the Shire was connected to the sea by the Brandywine River. Indeed, the Silmarillion tells us that rivers are the, quote, veins of the world. And so, just as Saruman could conceivably claim that the One Ring had, quote, rolled down the river to the sea, and just as the funeral boat carrying Boromir's body was swept down Anduin the Great out to the Bay of Belfalas, so too, in the primary world, the mighty Mississippi flows thousands of miles from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico. A connection between our Midwestern towns and the wider world. I had to alliterate there, so. My son and I saw this connection at work as we paddled south in our canoe. We passed enormous barges heading north, loaded with goods, presumably from faraway lands. And because the Mississippi was historically low that year, the remains of rusted shipwrecks were exposed. It was a reminder that the Mississippi and its tributaries have pulsed with trade and traffic since the days of Mark Twain, and even long before. But that day, we saw few other vessels. No ferries, no fishing boats, no pleasure boats. Our afternoon adventure was surely much quieter than the Mississippi would have been in its heyday. Indeed, according to the 1880 census, more than 5,000 vessels plied the rivers of the Mississippi Valley that year, carrying 6.7 million passengers. And that was decades after the extension of railroads west across the Mississippi, when trains finally began to eat away at river traffic. In Middle-earth, at the end of the Third Age, a similar change has taken place. Two river systems have become quiet and devoid of traffic. But here, the declines are driven by fear and war rather than by changes in technology. First, the Kelduin, or the river running. In The Hobbit, we learn that while the people of Laketown, quote, still throve on the trade that came up the great river from the south, there had been an earlier time when the town of Dale was, quote, rich and prosperous, and, quote, there had been fleets of boats on the waters, and some were filled with gold, and some with warriors in armor. But this ended with the destruction of Dale by the dragon Smaug. Second, the Anduin River in the Lord of the Rings. During the 9 days the Fellowship rowed down the river in their elven boats, they never encountered a vessel, unless you count goblins lying on a log, paddling with feet. Quote, seldom in my life has any boat come out of the north, Boromir says at one point, as the Fellowship seeks a way around the rapids. But as with the Mississippi in the primary world, the Anduin had not always been like that. Aragorn recalls that, quote, light boats used to journey out of Wilderland down to Osgiliath, and still did so until a few years ago, when the orcs of Mordor began to multiply. The Fellowship get the taste of this on the 8th night of their journey, when orcs shoot arrows at them from the eastern shore. Thankfully, my son and I did not have the same experience. Okay, finally, I'd like to talk about majestic monuments. For me, the most powerful thing about being in that canoe with my son on a great river was how small we felt. Frail and fleeting as little leaves, to borrow Tolkien's phrase, which led to a sense of awe and wonder near the end of our voyage as we encountered some of St. Louis's architectural and engineering marvels in a new way. I have often driven across bridges over the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers, or driven past the Gateway Arch on the interstate, but these encounters are fleeting. They're over in a moment. The experience is altogether different from the perspective of a small boat moving slowly in the midst of a great river. As our canoe drew closer to downtown, the landscape changed. Less green, fewer trees, more concrete and steel. We passed under a series of bridges, the Merchants Bridge, the McKinley, the Musial, the MLK, and finally, the amazing Eads Bridge. This picture doesn't do it justice. It's so much bigger when you're under it. Each one glided toward us slowly, steadily growing larger, until at last it filled all my vision. And then we were underneath, completely enveloped. And then the greatest marvel of them all, the silvery stainless steel Gateway Arch, sparkling in the sun. At the end of our voyage, I found myself awestruck, just like Frodo near the end of the Fellowship's voyage down the Anduin. Quote, Frodo, peering forward, saw in the distance 2 great rocks approaching. Like great pinnacles or pillars of stone they seemed. Tall and sheer and ominous, they stood upon either side of the stream. Behold the Argonath, the pillars of the kings, cried Aragorn. As Frodo was borne towards them, the great pillars rose like towers to meet him. Giants they seemed to him, vast gray figures, silent but threatening. Awe and fear fell upon Frodo, and he cowered down, shutting his eyes and not daring to look up as the boat drew near. I can't read this passage now without experiencing it viscerally in my imagination in a way that I never could before. And I can't help but contrast these 2 enormous monuments, the Gates of Argonath and the Gateway Arch. Both are magnificent pieces of architecture, major feats of engineering in their respective worlds, demanding the attention of any who pass by them or through them. Yet there is a key difference. The 2 pillars of the kings, with their stony frowns and raised palms, serve as a warning to Gondor's enemies, stay out! They evoke, quote, awe and fear. The arch, in contrast, evokes awe and wonder. It's meant to be a welcoming monument, a celebration of St. Louis's role as gateway to the West, an open door through which people poured as this nation expanded. And so at last, we were back at the feet of the arch, a towering monument and a reminder of good and bad. I'll close with this. In the past and the present of the American Midwest, There's much to be proud of and much to mourn. Tolkien's legendarium, too, is suffused with sadness and but brightened by moments of wonder, of hope, and of eucatastrophe. No matter where we're from, we'll find of Middle-earth, and that's part of what makes it work so well. But there will be times for all of us when we look around our parts of the primary world and feel that we're fighting a long defeat, like the elves, or that we're the spirit of Isengard, if not of Mordor. In such times of confusion and fear and shadow, the stories of Tolkien's secondary world can be for us like a white star peeping through the cloud rack. And they remind us that there is light and beauty forever beyond the shadow's reach. Thank you. Yes. Oh boy. So you're saying that because you're asking me how I would see my own children maybe in this room. Okay, yeah. You know you're sitting next to my daughter? Oh, there you go. Yeah. Is a big community, right? And there's like so many ways to contribute through art, through research or speaking or sharing ideas. Yeah, so I could totally see you doing it. Yes.
I used to row in Chattanooga on the Tennessee River, and I remember, not the Tennessee, the Tennessee River in Chattanooga, and going under the bridges and how really big they look when you're in a little tiny single skull.
Yeah.
And also, I recently was out in California in March, and the sea, and I just kept thinking about Tolkien when I was looking at the Pacific Ocean. It really nice when you can go out into nature and see Tolkien in your own surroundings, for sure.
Yeah, and that's what's really struck me is that, I mean, people all over the world love Tolkien, and it's because all those parts, they're like so applicable everywhere. Even some of the surprising parts, like to me, the Mounds were so surprising because, like, as a St. Louisan, it's not something even many St. Louisans know about our own history. That the Mounds existed, that we destroyed them, and like all the history between Europeans and the Native Americans that came before that. A lot of it is stuff that we don't know about, and yet there it is, like in Tolkien's Legendarium, the mound that he has these mounds too, and so it's just like this connection that I didn't even know was there. Yes. Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So I came to Tolkien very late. I mean, relatively late, I guess. I came to him in college with the release of the movies, and some of my friends in high school had the advantage on me. They had read Hobbit, The Ring, watch a movie. When the Fellowship of the Ring came out, they were very gung-ho. That's got to be our movie night. We had to go watch that and talk about it. And I was at a disadvantage because I didn't know the first thing about The Lord of the Rings. So we watched the movie I watched the movie like 5 times to try to story and try to figure it out. And then we had a movie night, and then after that I quickly got all the books and read them. And so it just kind of I loved it so much that I just kind of kept reading, and it just kind of became like a part of my mental universe, I guess. And so when I started having my own kids, reading is just like a really important thing in our family, and so we did a lot of reading with them. And my oldest daughter was precocious with reading and understanding things, so I read The Hobbit to her at a pretty young age. I don't remember exactly how old she was, but she loved it. And the tone elevates as you get to the end of The Hobbit, and she seemed to do okay through that part. And I thought, could we maybe do The Lord of the Rings? And so we started on that journey, and not every went well, but we did make it to the end, and she mostly stayed with it, and she was an attentive reader. And so at times, like when we were doing the chapter of the Council of Elrond, for example, and I believe it's Frodo talking to Glóin, and she figured out where that was going, and that the foreshadowing with Balin, and she kind of was, what happened to Balin? Because we had just read The Hobbit, and so she's like, and Balin is, the main friend there through that journey, and what happened to him? And so I've read The Lord of the Rings several times to all my kids, and to varying others. And then just like I do have a tendency to make connections like this to almost anyone I talk to at times. So like at holiday dinners and stuff, it comes up, and my family will tell you that I will kind of get into Tolkien stuff like that. So it's just kind of part of the language of it. And some of my kids are more interested in talking about it than others, but I think it all starts with the reading and with building that like mental universe, I guess, getting it in there. In your hand, Harry, or are you just doing a?
Maybe more of a comment than a question, but when you were showing the photos of the ship, the Hulk ship, right? Reminded me of, as the company of Dwarf and Bilbo are trekking across the land, seeing the ruins of Helgorn.
Yes.
Evoking that sense of something gone by that
Yes.
is like reminiscent of another time.
Exactly. Yeah. No. Like originally, my first section was titled like ruins and remnants, and I wanted to get more into the ruin, but in the interest of time, I just kind of tried to restrict it mostly to talking about the mounds and the Barrow Downs. But yeah, ruins are just like suffused the landscape of the Lord of the Rings. It's kind of like things that some of the other talks we heard earlier, that it helps develop that texture in the Lord of the Rings, because it makes you think of what was there before. And here in the United States, we're in a very different situation where there wasn't a whole lot before. But there was stuff before that we deliberately ignore. And that is part of our own history that we need to re-examine. There was stuff before, but maybe not the many civilizations that that are there in Europe. But we also have a prehistory that we should get more familiar with. All right. Thank you.